The routine turnaround. Jamal stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked on the officer's grip around the document. The tension was palpable, the stillness in the air now suffocating. 1,000 thoughts raced through Jamal's mind, but the one that stood out the most was the fear for his children, sitting quietly in the back seat. Zaria, his 7-year-old daughter, and Malik, his 5-year-old son, had never seen their father interact with law enforcement this way. He knew he had to protect them from the anxiety building in his chest. The officer's eyes were no longer just scanning the document. They were wide, filled with an intensity that made Jamal's skin crawl. Something was off. And Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to come crashing down, whether it was justified or not. "Is there something wrong with the paperwork?" Jamal asked, his voice more composed than he felt. His palms were sweating, his heart hammering against his chest, but he stood his ground. The officer didn't immediately respond. He turned the document over in his hands, his eyes flicking between it and Jamal as if he were trying to process what he was looking at. Jamal's breath hitched as he realized the officer was growing more and more unsettled with each passing second. This wasn't a typical stop, not even close. "Sir, I need you to step over here," the officer said after a long pause, his voice laced with an edge that was both commanding and hesitant. Jamal's eyes shot to the officer's radio, where he could see the faint flicker of light from the call that had just been made. His gut twisted. The officer had been in contact with someone, and whatever it wasn't just routine. He glanced back at his car, his mind racing. "What's going on?" he asked again, keeping his voice as steady as possible. "Is this about the car or the document?" The officer motioned for Jamal to take a few steps back. "I need you to wait here," he said tersely, and Jamal could hear the change in his tone. The friendly, professional demeanor had evaporated, replaced by something colder, more distant. As Jamal stood there, a sense of dread settled over him like a heavy blanket. The situation was rapidly escalating, and he had no idea why. He had done nothing wrong. He had never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law. His record was clean, his life quiet, and yet here he was, being treated like a suspect, all because of a piece of paper that was now sitting in the officer's hands. "Everything all right?" Jamal called out to the officer, hoping for some kind of explanation, some shred of clarity to emerge from the growing confusion. But the officer didn't answer. Instead, he stepped to the side, his back to Jamal now as he spoke into his radio. Jamal couldn't make out the words, but he knew whatever was being said wasn't good. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His instincts told him that this was more than just a traffic stop. Jamal turned to his kids again, forcing a smile for their sake. "It's going to be all right," he muttered, though even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Zaria and Malik didn't respond, but Jamal could feel their eyes on him, the silent question in their gaze. What was going on, and why wasn't Dad answering them? Zaria, always perceptive for her age, spoke up first. "Daddy, why's that policeman looking at you like that?" Jamal's throat tightened. How could he explain this to her? How could he make sense of something he didn't understand himself? "I don't know, sweetie," he said, his voice quieter now. "But we're going to be just fine. I promise." His children didn't seem convinced. He could see Malik's lip trembling in the rearview mirror, and Zaria's brow furrowed with worry. It hurt him to see them like this, worried about their father, scared for reasons they didn't even understand. The officer was now speaking more urgently into his radio. Jamal couldn't make out the full conversation, but he could hear the words, "suspicious," "possible connections," and "hold him here." His blood ran cold. His chest tightened as a new wave of panic surged through him. What was happening? What was it about this document that had made everything go from 0 to 60 in an instant? Jamal couldn't figure it out, but one thing was clear, this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It wasn't about speeding or a broken taillight. Something much bigger was at play. He turned to look at the officer again, his anxiety now mixed with frustration. "What is this about?" Jamal asked again, his voice steady but insistent. "What's going on?" The officer slowly approached him, the document still clutched tightly in his hands. For a moment, there was a brief silence, the air thick with anticipation. Jamal could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he met the officer's gaze. "Do you have any idea what's in this?" the officer asked, his voice low but serious. Jamal's stomach flipped. "I don't know what you're talking about. That's just some old paperwork. I don't even know why you're asking about it. It's none of your business." The officer shook his head, his eyes hardening. "That document," he began, but his words were cut off as his radio crackled to life once more. Jamal could only catch a few garbled words through the static, but they were enough to make his blood run cold. "I need backup," the officer said firmly into his radio. "We've got a potential situation here." Before Jamal could respond, the officer turned sharply and began walking back toward his patrol car. Jamal's heart raced in his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this a setup? Had someone planted that document in his car? He had no idea what was going on, but he could feel that the night had taken a dark turn. The storm that had been brewing inside him was now full of thunder. As the officer approached his car, Jamal's eyes narrowed in suspicion. He knew the game had changed. He had to stay calm, think clearly, and protect his family, because this wasn't just about him anymore. Then, just as the officer reached for his radio, Jamal heard the unmistakable sound of sirens wailing in the distance, growing louder. His gut clenched. He had no idea what was about to unfold, but he knew this was only the beginning. A trap unfolds. The sirens were getting louder now, and Jamal's heart was thudding painfully in his chest. The flashing lights from the police vehicles in the distance made the rainy night feel surreal, as if everything was happening in slow motion. The officer had moved back to his patrol car, but Jamal could see the unmistakable tension in his posture, the way he kept glancing toward Jamal's car as if trying to decide his next move. Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was being set up for something he didn't understand, something far worse than just an ordinary traffic stop. He kept his eyes on the officer, his mind racing through every possible scenario. His thoughts kept returning to that document. What was it? Who put it in his trunk? And why was it causing such a shift in the officer's behavior? Zaria and Malik were quiet in the back seat, and Jamal had never been more grateful for their silence. The last thing he wanted was for them to see the fear in his eyes. They were his world. He had to stay strong, for them. The officer returned to his patrol car, speaking urgently into his radio. Jamal strained to hear what was being said, but the words were indistinct, drowned out by the hum of the radio static. From the officer's expression, though, it was clear that something serious was being discussed. The way he held the microphone close to his mouth, the way his eyes darted around, and the urgency in his voice told Jamal that this wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. Jamal took a slow, steadying breath. He had to keep his composure. This wasn't the time to panic, not with his children watching. Whatever was happening, he needed to handle it calmly, without giving anyone a reason to escalate things further. But his mind kept circling back to that document. It felt like a key to a door he didn't want to open. A few moments passed in tense silence before another patrol car pulled up behind the first one. The new officers, a man and a woman, both got out, their eyes scanning the scene with a practiced, almost clinical detachment. The woman approached the officer who had stopped Jamal, and they exchanged a few quick words that Jamal couldn't hear. One of the officers turned toward Jamal. His face was grim, and his eyes held a look of disapproval, as if he had already judged him without hearing his side of the story. "Sir," the man said in a voice that was cold and authoritative, "step over here." Jamal's gut twisted. He didn't like the way the officer said it, as if his presence was no longer a courtesy. He had done nothing wrong. He hadn't been speeding, he wasn't a criminal, and he wasn't hiding anything. But there was no use arguing with them. For the time being, he was a suspect in whatever they were investigating, and he had no idea why. "Just follow my lead," Jamal muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He could feel his nerves creeping up his spine, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Okay," he said aloud, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, "I'm stepping over. But I need to know what's going on. Why are you doing this? Why are you searching my car?" The female officer looked him up and down, her expression unreadable. "You're not under arrest yet, but we're conducting a search based on information we've received." "Information? What kind of information?" Jamal asked, his voice rising slightly with frustration. The officer gave him a sharp look, her eyes narrowing. "We're investigating something related to a crime," she said curtly, not offering more than that. "You can either cooperate or you can make things difficult. Your choice." Jamal took a deep breath, holding it in for a second before exhaling slowly. He had to think. He knew his rights. He wasn't being told the full story, but they couldn't just take him in without cause. He had done nothing wrong. The female officer turned to her partner, exchanging a glance that Jamal couldn't decipher. Then they both approached the trunk, and Jamal followed them at a distance, his eyes never leaving the officer's movements. As they opened the trunk again, the officer who had first stopped Jamal held up the document, still tightly clutched in his hands. The glare of the patrol car's headlights reflected off the paper, making it gleam in the dark like some kind of ominous sign. "Do you recognize this?" the officer asked, his voice carrying a note of accusation that Jamal didn't miss. Jamal took a step closer, but he still couldn't make out the document's contents from where he stood. His mind raced, and he shook his head. "No," Jamal said firmly, his voice steady. "I don't know what that is. I'm telling you, I haven't seen it before." The officer didn't seem convinced. He held the paper out, as if expecting Jamal to somehow remember something about it. "You don't recognize it? This is a legal document tied to a large investigation. You don't think that's something you should know about?" Jamal felt his heart drop in his chest. A legal document? Investigation? What the hell was going on? He knew his rights, and he knew they didn't have probable cause to keep searching his car or detain him without telling him more. "I don't know anything about it," Jamal repeated, trying to stay calm but feeling the panic rising in his throat. "I swear to you, I haven't seen that paper before." The officer's eyes narrowed as he looked at Jamal with a mix of suspicion and frustration. "Then how did it end up in your car?" That was the question Jamal had been asking himself. How did it get there? His mind raced again, thinking back to every single moment that led to this point. He couldn't figure it out. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was being dragged into something far bigger than he could possibly understand. "Are you sure this is the right person?" Jamal asked, his voice shaky but determined. "You've got the wrong man. I'm just a regular guy, trying to get home to my kids. I don't have anything to do with any investigation. I don't know anything about any crime." The officers exchanged a glance, their uncertainty clear. But that didn't stop them from continuing with their search. They weren't ready to let him go just yet. Jamal could feel his palms sweating, his heart racing faster now. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew it wasn't good. The longer they kept him here, the worse things would get. His kids were still in the car, watching, listening. He couldn't let them see him break down. He had to stay strong. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jamal saw something that made his stomach turn. Another officer, one he hadn't noticed before, was walking toward his car with a familiar, cold smile on his face. This officer wasn't here by accident. The hidden truth. The new officer approaching Jamal's car was unlike the others. His demeanor was unsettling, too calm, too assured. He didn't seem rushed, even though the situation was escalating quickly. There was something calculated about the way he walked toward them, his boots clicking against the wet pavement. His uniform was pressed, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights of the patrol car. Everything about him screamed authority, but not the kind that felt just. Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the officer's eyes met his. This officer's gaze was colder, like he had seen everything and expected nothing to surprise him. He wasn't here by chance. No, this man was here for a reason. Is there a problem? Jamal asked, his voice now low but edged with a mixture of confusion and growing concern. He could feel the weight of the night pressing on him, the storm clouds over his mind threatening to burst. The officer stopped just a few feet away, eyeing Jamal without responding for a long moment. There was a silence between them, one that felt suffocating, thick with unspoken tension. "I'm Officer Brooks," the man finally said, his voice calm and measured, but there was an air of menace in his words. "And you're in more trouble than you think." Jamal's mind raced, but he didn't let his fear show. He forced himself to stand tall, his hands still visible in front of him, a shield against whatever was coming next. "I don't know what this is about, but I'm not a criminal. I just want to go home." "You're wasting my time, and my kids' time." Officer Brooks didn't flinch. "You're not going anywhere," he said coldly. "Not until we get some answers. You have something in your car that doesn't belong to you." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, doesn't belong to me? I'm not hiding anything. I don't even know what you're talking about." "Don't play games," Brooks said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. He gestured toward the officer who was still holding the document. "You've been linked to a case. A case that involves organized crime and fraud. This document you've been so eager to deny, it connects you to that case. You may not know how, but you're tied to it, and we're going to figure out how." The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. Organized crime? Fraud? He could feel his world beginning to spin. His mind struggled to process what Officer Brooks had just said. None of it made sense. He wasn't involved in anything like that. He was a single father, working 2 jobs to take care of his kids. He didn't have any connections to crime, much less organized crime. "Sir, there's been some kind of mistake," Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know anything about this case. I don't have any connections to any criminals, no fraud, no. Whatever you're talking about. This is a mistake." But the officer wasn't listening. He was already turning to the other officer, a silent exchange passing between them. Jamal could see it, the confirmation. They believed him guilty before he had even said another word. His skin crawled with the realization that the system was already working against him, regardless of his innocence. Officer Brooks looked back at Jamal, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "I don't care if you know anything or not. What matters is you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that's enough for us to bring you in." Jamal's breath hitched. He didn't have the luxury of time anymore. He couldn't waste another second trying to explain himself. His children were still in the car, and the thought of them being pulled into this mess terrified him. He had to think fast. "Please, you don't have to do this," Jamal said urgently, his voice rising in desperation. "I haven't done anything. You're accusing me of something I don't even understand. My kids are in the car. Please. Can't you see this is all wrong?" Officer Brooks didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing in on Jamal. "We're not here to discuss your innocence. We're here to find out how deep you're involved. You can keep pretending if you want, but you're wasting both of our time." Jamal felt his stomach churn. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but all he could think about was his kids. He couldn't let them see him fall apart. He couldn't let them feel the fear he was struggling with. He glanced back at the car, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. Zarya and Malik were watching him through the rearview mirror, their eyes wide with confusion and concern. They could feel the shift in the air, the sudden tension, the quiet urgency. Jamal could see Zarya's lip trembling, and Malik had his small hands gripping the seat in front of him, his face pale. Jamal swallowed hard, forcing himself to calm down. He couldn't lose it now. He couldn't let the officers see how terrified he was. He had to protect his family, no matter the cost. "Look," Jamal said, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm not involved in anything you're talking about. But if you really think I am, then I want to talk to a lawyer. I want my rights respected. You can't just accuse me without proof." For a brief moment, Jamal thought he saw a flicker of hesitation in Officer Brooks' eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The officer's expression hardened again, and he stepped back, signaling to the other officers. "Fine. But we're bringing you in for questioning. You're not going anywhere until we get to the bottom of this." As the officers moved to surround Jamal, a sense of finality settled over him. He was being treated like a criminal, and no matter how much he pleaded, it didn't seem to matter. They had already made their decision. "Sir, don't do this," Jamal said, his voice tight with emotion. "Please, you're making a mistake." Officer Brooks didn't respond. He simply motioned for Jamal to move toward one of the patrol cars. And just as Jamal was about to take his first step toward the car, he heard a voice from behind him, Zarya's voice, clear and steady. "Daddy, are you going to be okay?" Jamal froze. His heart stopped for a second as he turned toward the car. Zarya's wide, worried eyes locked onto his, and for a split second, everything seemed to stand still. "Don't worry, baby," he called back, forcing a smile through the lump in his throat. "I'm going to be okay. I promise." But deep inside, Jamal wasn't so sure anymore. The breaking point. The cold night air felt like a slap to Jamal's face as he took his first hesitant step toward the patrol car. His heart was a drum in his chest, thudding louder with each movement. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the situation was physically pressing down on him. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He couldn't wrap his head around it. How had everything spiraled so quickly? How had a simple drive home turned into an interrogation? A potential arrest? A nightmare? "Daddy," Zarya's voice, small but filled with so much worry, echoed in his mind, refusing to let him forget the most important thing in his life, his children. He couldn't let them see him falter. They had to believe that no matter what was happening, their father was in control. As he reached the patrol car, Officer Brooks motioned for him to stop, turning toward the other officers who had been working the scene. They spoke quietly among themselves, their words too muffled to make out, but Jamal didn't need to hear them to understand. The decision had already been made. Jamal's heart skipped again when one of the officers moved to open the door of the patrol car, signaling for him to get inside. The cold metal of the door seemed to mock him, its chill sinking deep into his bones. He was no longer in control of this situation. No longer in control of his fate. They had made up their minds. No matter how much he denied his involvement in whatever they thought he had done, they weren't listening anymore. He was just another suspect, another nameless face they could pin something on. "Get in the car, now," Officer Brooks ordered, his voice low and commanding. Jamal swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. His instinct screamed at him to refuse, to demand a lawyer right then and there, but his children were watching him. Zarya's tear-filled eyes followed his every movement, and Malik, who had always been the quiet observer, was gripping the seat, his little face full of confusion. Jamal couldn't stand the thought of them seeing him in handcuffs, couldn't stand the idea of them experiencing whatever nightmare this was becoming. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the car. "I'm not involved in anything," he whispered to himself, but it was no use. The words felt hollow. The reality of the situation was setting in, and no amount of denial could change the course of what was happening. Jamal moved toward the car, the sound of his own footsteps filling the silence. The rain had started coming down harder now, the droplets pelting the windshield like tiny daggers. Inside the car, the atmosphere was thick with tension. He could feel Officer Brooks' eyes on his back, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to give them a reason to escalate the situation. He climbed into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach twist. As he settled into the uncomfortable plastic seat, he noticed the cold stares from the officers who were now in the car with him. They didn't speak as they drove, the silence so heavy it almost felt suffocating. Jamal kept his eyes on the road ahead, watching the flashing lights reflected in the wet streets, but his thoughts were far from the outside world. His mind kept replaying the moments leading up to this point. The document. That damn document. It still haunted him. What had been on that paper? What did they think it meant? How had it ended up in his trunk? He couldn't remember ever seeing it before, but it was the only clue they had to tie him to whatever crime they were investigating. He had to figure it out. He had to clear his name. But then, another thought crept into his mind: was it really just the document? What if it wasn't just a mistake, a mix-up, or bad luck? What if he was being set up? Jamal's thoughts were interrupted when the car took a sharp turn onto a different road, one that seemed to be leading away from the city center. He leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of where they were headed. His pulse quickened. Where were they taking him? Where are we going? Jamal finally asked, his voice hoarse but demanding. He had to know. The officer driving, a quiet man with a hard, expressionless face, didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, both hands firmly gripping the wheel. The only sound in the car was the hum of the tires against the wet pavement, the rhythmic pulse of the sirens in the distance. "We're taking you to a holding facility," the officer said, his voice cold and detached. "You'll be processed there. You'll be questioned." Questioned about what? Jamal pressed, his anger starting to rise. "I don't know anything about any crime. Why am I being treated like this?" The officer glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Jamal's eyes for just a brief moment. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of the investigation," he said. "All I know is that you're connected to it, and right now, that's enough." Jamal let out a frustrated breath. His fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to relax. Losing his temper would only make things worse, and he needed to keep his head clear. His children were still in his mind, he couldn't let them see him unravel. Not like this. Not now. The drive felt endless, and as they moved further away from the heart of the city, Jamal felt the weight of his situation growing heavier. The city lights faded into the darkness of the countryside, and he could feel himself being pulled deeper into whatever nightmare this was. They didn't care about his innocence. They had already decided he was guilty. All that mattered now was finding out how far he was involved. The car finally came to a stop, the brakes screeching slightly as it pulled into a large, industrial building. The place looked deserted, the windows dark, the exterior of the building weathered and grim. Jamal's heart sank as the officer parked the patrol car and turned off the engine. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want any of this. The officer who had been sitting in the passenger seat turned to face Jamal. "You stay in the car," he said bluntly. "We'll be back in a minute. Don't try anything stupid." Jamal watched the two officers exit the vehicle, leaving him alone in the back of the patrol car. His eyes remained fixed on the building in front of him. His mind raced. This wasn't a regular precinct, not a place where ordinary people were brought in for questioning. This felt more like a holding facility for people who had already been convicted in the eyes of the law. He needed a plan. He had to think. What were his options? He couldn't just sit here and wait to be processed for a crime he didn't commit. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about proving his innocence, about keeping his family safe, about getting back to the life he'd built. But how? How could he fight something so insidious, so powerful? As the rain continued to drum on the roof of the patrol car, Jamal felt a deep sense of urgency. He couldn't wait for answers. He couldn't wait for things to fall into place. If there was any hope of clearing his name, it would have to come from him. The officers returned moments later, their faces hard and unreadable. Without a word, they opened the door and motioned for Jamal to step out. He did so without a word, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. The descent into darkness. The air outside the patrol car was cold, the chill biting into Jamal's skin as he stepped onto the grimy concrete of the facility. The building loomed above him like some forgotten monument to human misery. He could hear the faint sounds of footsteps in the distance, the echo of doors opening and closing, the muffled sounds of voices carrying in the gloom. But everything felt distant. His world had become a tunnel, and the only thing he could focus on now was getting out, getting back to his children, getting back to his life. But that seemed more and more like an impossible dream with each passing second. The officers led him into the building through a heavy, metal door that groaned as it swung open. The interior of the facility smelled stale, like old leather and metal, and the walls were adorned with harsh fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, casting long, eerie shadows across the narrow hallway. The place was a fortress, cold, sterile, and unfeeling. Jamal's mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had happened. A document in his trunk had turned his entire world upside down. And now, here he was, being escorted down a hallway, surrounded by officers who already considered him guilty. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had walked into some kind of trap. The more he thought about it, the more he began to suspect that someone had deliberately planted that document in his trunk. But who? And why? Who was behind all of this? "Stay quiet and follow our lead," Officer Brooks said, his voice harsh, cutting through Jamal's spiraling thoughts. The officer's tone made it clear that any resistance would not be tolerated. Jamal's hands were cuffed behind him, the cold metal digging into his wrists with each movement. The officers walked with purpose, their steps echoing down the hallway. Jamal couldn't help but glance around as they passed. The walls were lined with doors, some of them cracked open, revealing empty rooms, others filled with the faint sounds of conversations, murmurs, and the shuffle of feet. They finally stopped in front of a door marked with a sign that read, "Interrogation Room 3." It felt like the door to his fate. A shiver ran down his spine as they opened the door, revealing a small, sterile room. A metal table sat in the center, flanked by 2 chairs. The light overhead buzzed softly, and the silence inside the room felt suffocating. "Sit," Officer Brooks commanded, pushing Jamal into one of the chairs. Jamal didn't resist. He took a seat, his heart pounding, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. This wasn't a place for the innocent. This wasn't a place where people who had done nothing wrong were treated with respect. This was a place where the guilty were broken. Where the innocent were often forced to play by the system's rules, even if they weren't the ones who had committed the crime. The door slammed shut behind them, and Jamal was left alone in the room with his thoughts. His hands were still cuffed behind the chair, the sharp metal pressing into his wrists. The sound of footsteps faded as the officers moved away, and the silence in the room seemed to close in on him. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging out like an eternity. He could hear the steady beat of his own heart in his ears, and the weight of his situation pressed down on him like a 100-pound stone. Minutes passed, and Jamal's mind whirled. What had he done to deserve this? He wasn't a criminal. He didn't belong here. His mind replayed every moment of his life, every choice, every step that had led him to this point. He had worked hard to build a life for himself and his kids. He wasn't the person the police seemed to think he was. He was just trying to be a good father, a good man. And yet here he was, locked in a small, cold room, with no answers, no explanation, and no way out. The door opened suddenly, breaking the silence. Jamal's head snapped up, and his body tensed in response. 2 officers entered. One was Officer Brooks, his face as cold as ever, while the other was a woman, tall, with sharp features and an air of authority about her. The woman glanced at Jamal for a moment before sitting down across from him. Her eyes were calculating, as though she were already sizing him up, trying to figure out what kind of man he was. Officer Brooks remained standing, his arms folded across his chest. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," the woman said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You're connected to something bigger than you realize. And I'm going to give you a chance to tell me your side of the story." Jamal's stomach churned. This wasn't about listening to him, not really. This was about finding a way to make him fit the narrative they had already created. He had been chosen as a suspect, and they weren't about to let that go. They wanted to break him, to make him admit to something, anything. It didn't matter if he was innocent, what mattered was getting the answers they wanted. "I've told you already," Jamal said, his voice calm but tinged with frustration. "I don't know anything about this crime. I don't even know why I'm here. I'm just a guy trying to make a living. I don't have anything to do with any investigation." The woman leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she regarded him. "That's what they all say. But there's one thing you're not telling me. One thing that ties you to this case, whether you know it or not." Jamal's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice rising a bit in disbelief. "I've told you, I don't know anything about this case. Why won't you listen?" The woman didn't respond right away. She pulled out a folder from the bag she carried and placed it on the table, flipping it open with a sharp movement. She glanced at the papers inside, her fingers flipping through the pages methodically. Finally, she looked up at Jamal, her expression unreadable. "We have evidence that links you to a large-scale fraud operation. Your name was found in connection with a financial transaction that involves multiple people we've been investigating for months. You may not have been aware of it, but you're connected, and we know it." Jamal's mind reeled. A fraud operation? How? His hands were shaking now, his heart racing with panic. He had no idea what she was talking about. He had never been involved in anything like that. "You're lying," Jamal spat, his voice cracking with the weight of his disbelief. "I don't know any criminals. I don't know anything about this. Why are you doing this to me?" The woman's eyes remained cold, unwavering. "You don't have to know anything to be involved. Your name came up, Jamal. And now, we're going to find out just how deep your involvement goes." Jamal felt the room closing in on him. There was no escape, no way out. They had already decided his fate, and no amount of pleading would change that. The woman stood up, signaling that the interrogation was over for now. She motioned for Officer Brooks to follow her out of the room, but before the door closed behind them, she turned back to Jamal. "We'll be back," she said, her voice low and menacing. "And next time, we'll make sure you tell us the truth." The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Jamal in the silence once again. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just about getting answers. This was about breaking him. They had all the power. And Jamal had nothing. But there was one thing he still had, the truth. No matter how dark this place seemed, no matter how hard they tried to make him crumble, he couldn't let them take that from him. He had to find a way out. He had to find a way to prove his innocence.